If you've been learning Mandarin for some time, you may or may not have been considering taking a Mandarin class, but I'm going to stop you right there because you have not seen that classes are not as glamorous as they seem to be. Because if you want to, let's say, learn some basics of a language, I highly recommend you use things like Duolingo or some other language learning app, or even things like a phrasebook if you want to go to, let's say, China or Taiwan and then spend some time there, maybe a couple weeks, be able to like speak with locals a little bit, then those are the methods I recommend. But even things, let's say, the immersion learning method that I've been using, where instead of using things like classrooms and textbooks as your main way of studying, use things like foreign media like TV shows, movies, books, and even video games in order to gain an intuition of the language instead of just trying to crank it around in your head. And one of the biggest scares that I've heard a lot is that how am I able to learn Mandarin if I don't have a class? Because Mandarin is a very hard language as it seems to be. It's on the really top of the scale on the difficulty of foreign languages. Let's say the US government thing where they talk about how difficult it is to learn certain foreign languages, and Mandarin's all the way on the top there. And just seeing things like characters and tones that may seem very daunting at first. You may think that you need classes to learn Mandarin, but I'm just going to debunk that right now. You don't need classes to learn Mandarin. In fact, there are many people that have done it. Well, I've been learning Mandarin for my experience for around 2 years using this immersion method, getting to around an unofficial B1 HSK 4-5 level after estimating my level with some tutors, with a tutor, and also taking a mock test online. But also, I've also been taking classes as well in Mandarin for, yes, you will hear this right, 12 years. And those 12 years, I have been extremely inconsistent with learning Mandarin, as well as just having things like summer and winter breaks, not really being able to acquire much except from just the basics of learning Mandarin. Only until recently, I have been able to, with these 2 years of immersion learning, been able to break off that beginner plateau and then eventually get to where I am right now. And you may do something, let's say, counter me. Let's say, oh, the reason why you're able to do things, let's say, immersed for 2 years is because you've been able to do classrooms for 12 years. But even then, if that was a help, which I won't deny, it definitely has helped me in order to get into immersion learning, I don't think it's going to take 12 years of just constant going to take just 12 years in order just to learn some basics of Mandarin. In fact, I've already known lots more people that have been able to get into a much better situation where they only need to maybe even just spend maybe just 1 year or even just a couple months learning if they're a lot more intense, where they just learn the basics of Mandarin and it doesn't take them 12 years to do so. So in this video, I'm going to explain some of the benefits that classrooms give, but also tell you how you can take advantage of these, either if you're in a classroom yourself or being forced to, or if you're someone that's using immersion methods and have been finding it's been difficult and have been almost trying to consider classes. Because the best case scenario is that you don't take classes at all, you just do self-study and just use free resources online or a lot more cheaper resources that have been found. But there are some exceptions as well, which I will just cover right now, which is classes, usually let's say the ALG style classes, which they give you a lot more comprehensible input, or classes like full immersion style classes that you're forced in this language bubble and you're only able to speak Mandarin. These are different cases, but I'm going to be talking about more like the traditional American style Spanish classroom type of classes that you'll find with Mandarin. So let's go get right into it. The study replacement. The reason why I do not like the studying type in classes, even though they can be quite useful for certain beginners, is simply put it, they usually tend to be mixed with their priorities. For example, a lot of them tend to be pretty bad at teaching tones. Usually, tones are going to be just like this thing that, yes, it's very important to know tones, but it's like not something that's covered as much. Usually, it's going to be around 6 weeks where they just cover tones and then they'll just leave it there. The only thing you need to know is to just learn how to memorize tones, and they won't actually give you some sort of intense process of just trying to listen and try to accustom your ears to tones, because tones are very important in Mandarin. They change meanings And if you do not try to get yourself used to tones early on, you can definitely do it later on, and it's not going to be something that's impossible, but it's a lot better if you try to get used to it early on, or at least know some of the basics so that you can start noticing it early on, because English is not a tonal language. Another example I can give is how they usually approach characters. Yes, ironically enough, these are the two hardest parts of learning Chinese, and usually these are the things that they usually approach the worst. Well, characters are, in my experience, they usually tend to leave it out for some time, or they'll just let you do some traditional memorization through things like flashcards, or the worst way, which is memorizing thousands of words by just trying to write and write and write and write all of them. Usually they don't give you, usually they do cover some reading material. However, it's things that are only intensive, and usually these materials are only just for beginners. They can get quite stale and boring after some time. And if you're not interested in something, it's going to be a lot harder to learn from it. And also, if you're someone that has been struggling with characters and reading, I highly recommend you check out the first link in the description, where it's a course that goes over topics like these on how to be able to read Mandarin without having to do things like go through multiple hours of just boring readers, or things just like memorizing thousands of characters. Because usually, for the most part in classes, they will make you memorize these characters and give you some bits of context, but these contexts in reading, especially if it's something that you haven't handpicked yourself, aren't going to be as interesting. And also, a lot of the methods that I've just mentioned usually don't come with context, and context is very important when learning a language, even when you're still a complete beginner, because it'll put words into, well, their action, and you can see them, how they work, how they form themselves, what meanings they did put themselves in, and you are going to have a lot less of translations in your head, especially if you memorize things with just flashcards. It's going to be a lot easier to have these things as just treated with English logic, where you're going to have some times where you have weird sentences like these, where yes, it's technically correct with English grammar, but just sounds super weird and unnatural in Chinese, because both languages are not the same. That's the thing. That I can say about why studying in classes can usually not be a very great experience. But if you are someone that has been studying in classes, I highly recommend you could just stick with it and just do the bare minimum in things like testing and the character and tone things that I've just mentioned. Because a lot of times testing as well, even though I like to test myself, testing is not a necessary part of learning a language. Because if you're just going to be learning for the sake of learning something, even if you're going to be learning to a really high level or fluency, tests aren't really a great way to, well, advance yourself in a language. It could be sometimes just a nice way to see what level you are, but it's just best that you just put the tests aside and just consume more media. You are going to get used to it eventually. But now let's go to the next part, which I think these 2 points are actually going to be a lot more powerful in terms of classes, where I have been able to find some more success with them, which is going to be more of the accountability and the social aspect of classes. Because these are 2 aspects that I have found a lot more prominent in classes, that are a lot more stronger than just studying. Because in terms of immersion learning, it can be a lot more lonely. I mean, think of it. You're going to be sitting down, watching some show, and then you're pretty much going to be studying it that way. So accountability. The accountability aspect, as I mentioned, with things like tests, can be a very, very powerful thing, because, well, there's now going to be things like deadlines, expectations of you. And even, for example, when I've been just dabbling in Spanish, I had to take a Spanish course just a couple of weeks ago, and I've been able to get consistent in Spanish for just a short amount of time just because of that thing. But then again, it just goes to show, because my reason to learn Mandarin is a lot more greater than my reason to learn Spanish, it wasn't very long after, where then when I was starting to no longer have this Spanish class, I just switched all of my time back to Mandarin, and now my Spanish time just looks all white compared to the orange that was sometimes here and there with the classes. Because honestly, in terms of accountability, one of your first biggest problems I found isn't because of your accountability or your, let's say, habits. Well, definitely these habits and goals are going to be a lot more important than you think. However, it's mostly because of your reason, which is also another big thing, which is classrooms. Because a lot of people usually tend to take classes just for the reason to get college credits. And the only thing that's keeping them from studying more is going to be that accountability aspect. Well, yes, it is very powerful, even with a good reason to learn. If you do not have a good reason to learn, it's not going to be very long after, just like me, where you soon stop learning said language, or let's say you're going to go back to language. Let's say for me, because I've been learning Spanish just for some time in order to take a break with Mandarin, but also just because of the classroom aspect. Definitely I was able to keep myself accountable, but then it was not very long after which then I knew I was going to go back to Mandarin. If you don't not have a good reason to learn said language, if you don't develop one after some time, it's going to be very, very hard unless you're going to be quite dependent on the classroom's accountability in order to keep you accountable. But accountability is still a very important part, and having things like habits and daily habits and goals in order to do it. So how do we do this? Well, I'd highly recommend you either A, get some sort of habit tracker, and also B, which also applies to the next section, find things like a Discord server or even things like language exchange partners where you can keep yourself accountable in learning each other's languages. Because first of all, the things like a habit tracker, let's say, for example, you could have something as simple as, let's say, paper on the wall where you have a checklist on, let's say, habits, which is a very effective thing I found for beginners. But also having things, let's say, for example, an online tracker. With this online tracker, you can, let's say, input the amount of hours you've done. Let's say you could track, let's say, I've been doing this activity, I'll put it here. I've been doing that activity, I'll put it here. And then you can really see your data. And I found myself, it helps really gamify some of the processes of the long process of immersion and make it more rewarding as you see yourself and see more numbers go up and down. But the next section is going to be more of the social aspect. The social aspect, I'd say, is a lot more harder to replicate, as I've demonstrated earlier, because most of the time, immersion learning is going to be quite lonely, and immersion learning is actually quite unknown because if you're someone that has been watching this channel for a while, you may or may not think that, oh, immersion learning is so common, everyone on YouTube talks about it. It's actually not as common as you think it is, and most people language classes, I have not found to this day a single person where I've been able to successfully convince or has found someone that has actually been using immersion methods, not online, in person. And this is why I highly recommend you use things like online communities, let's say Discord server. And this is why I highly recommend you use things like online servers like Discord communities, because usually the social aspect in classrooms can be good, but also it's not the best. We could do a lot better because most of the people just I've mentioned, they aren't usually immersion learners, and no offense, most of them usually don't have a very good reason to learn. However, in the rare case you do find a very motivated learner, let's say just like you, I'd highly recommend you try to communicate with them, you try to interact with them more, keep yourself accountable, because it's going to be very, very powerful once you have a lot more than one person in order to accompany with you learning Mandarin. Because you may just think, oh, I just want to be able to learn myself because that's what immersion learning is about. But I have found if you have been able to find an accountability partner, it is going to be a lot more powerful than you just being alone yourself. But not only just students, what about the teacher? Well, the teacher, it depends as well, because if you want to be able to know if a teacher is good or not, simply you just need to know how good their second language is. Usually their second language has to be, let's say, one that they've learned in adulthood, so they also know, let's say, the trials and tribulations they had to go through with learning a second language, since that's what you're exactly doing with Mandarin. If you can find a teacher like that, I highly recommend you can ask them questions and things like, for example, oh, how can I find good media in my language, or how can I be able to learn, let's say, this thing, what's your experience with other, let's say, students, and what can you, let's say, recommend me for, let's say, these things. Because if a teacher is good, they can be extremely helpful in order to help you. They can also help you things with, say, corrected output. Although keep in mind as well that most teachers are usually going to be busy people and they're not going to be your private tutors. You can use things, let's say, italki with tutors that are actually quite relatively cheap, not sponsored, but I've just used it and had a great experience with it. If you want a tutor in order to help you use things, let's say, output in order to get you pronunciation practice And if you want to be able to find things online, let's say accountability partners, I'd highly recommend go online, check out Discord servers. I'll put some in the link in the description. I've already mentioned it many times before. And that's all I really have to say about what are some things in classrooms that you could also replicate in immersion learning, because just like me in the beginning, I used to always think like things where I always needed a classroom to learn the basics of a language. But after learning for some time and even dabbling in Spanish for a little bit, it's pretty clear that you don't need to have a classroom, or it's not completely necessary to have a classroom in order to be able to learn a language and its basics. So if you're also more interested in all the nitty-gritty details in order to learn the basics, check out all the other videos on my channels where I teach you how to do things like set up Anki, also some things, let's say the full language learning guide where I will teach you how to go about things, let's say learning basic vocabulary, or how to find resources in media, or what to do if you don't understand anything, all these things in my channel. So we have a lot to explore. 我们的旅程刚刚开始 and good luck to your Mandarin learning journey.